right, we're going to go ahead and get started here, everyone. My name is Lindsay Crossan. I work with BCC Research as the events manager, and I would like to thank you all for joining us today for our webinar, State of the Union on Sensors Technology, with our senior editor, Michael Sullivan. Michael will be offering a bit of a recap of his time at the Sensors Expo and provide us some personal insights about what's on the horizon for sensors technology through his experience at the Expo and his research for our reports. Before we begin, I would like to let you know a few things about our webinar platform. We are going to be recording this presentation and our phone lines are on mute. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please be sure to send them in via the chat feature. The chat can be found at the top right of your screen, and send those questions in as they come to you so we can make sure we get them answered for you in the time we have allotted today. So a little bit more about Michael Sullivan. Michael has been with BCC Research since 2014, and he has pioneered our information technology category, which in that he has significantly expanded it to provide in-depth coverage of new areas, such as the technologies surrounding the Internet of Things. He has conducted market research projects for IBM, Microsoft, Dell, and Schneider Electric, among many others. Michael keynoted the Medical Sensors Design Conference, which was held just prior to the Sensors Expo. So he has a lot of great insights to share. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Lindsay, and thank you, everybody, for joining this State of the Union for Sensors Technology today. There I am, and this presentation is going to look at some of the key themes that came out of both the Sensors Expo and the Medical Design Conference, which was held in San Jose this past last week. We are seeing a major trend towards sensors fusion and diffusion, and I'll explain what that means. Both of them are enabling an expanded opportunity for the providers of sensor modules and the devices that contain the modules and the integration services that are included in that. We'll summarize the key takeaways from the Sensors Expo. Look at things from a technology view. What are some of the emerging and interesting technologies that we've seen in the sensor industry from the Expo? Look at some of the key messages from the keynote speakers that were present at the conference. Highlight a little bit about the key messages from the medical sensors aspect that was referenced. Close with some questions and answers. So first, the topic of sensor fusion. Sensor fusion, as we know, is about combining an array of generally different kinds of sensors to increase the certainty or decrease the uncertainty of what's being measured, whether that's a medical device measuring something for a diagnostic purpose, or on the industrial floor measuring product quality or the quality of a process. We're seeing an increase in sensor fusion, a realization of fusion, if you will, which has certainly been a topic that's been pursued for some time. The driver for that fusion is not only fusion within a single device, but now we're able to expand that to fusion from a network of sensors, right? We can conceive of and actually see examples of leveraging IoT, leveraging the connectivity modules and sensor arrays to combine in a fused view of a single event to bring data back across the network to allow for an aggregation and a determination of what's actually happening in that event. So fusion, both traditional form and fusion through the advent of connectivity is driving increased value. Another level on that, another notch on that was emerging at the conference is the idea of data fusion. So the sensor arrays then from multiple events providing more accurately assessed phenomena bring back data that then can be aggregated to increase the granularity of what's being measured. So the internet also enables an aggregation of the data in a fusion sense as well. The other comment here was diffusion. and that is at the same time we're seeing many instances of sensor fusion and where that adds value. We also saw many instances of new kinds of combinations of sensor modules really deployed in many applications across the industry and very evident across the show floor, everywhere from robotics, as you can see our friend here, to other manifestations of artificial intelligence, to virtually every kind of industry. So a multiplicity of modules, sensor modules, multi-sensor modules, and modules dedicated to sensor fusion. Specifically then, where the demand for greater accuracy is being most driven is in this list of industries or examples of applications that we're showing here. So we have the ability to better identify the biological factors that go into a food safety application or the processing of food in an efficiency or agricultural efficiency and environmental condition kind of way. So think about sensor fusion aligned to the topic of criticality. So where does the greatest accuracy need to happen? It happens where the data that's being transferred has a critical nature to it, either a business efficiency or even a health efficiency, a life-saving efficiency. We can definitely see it in the self-driving vehicles where the combination, the sensor fusion, whether it be individual modules, onboard sensors in the vehicle or data collected over the data fusion aspect, the network fusion, allowing that vehicle to be able to interpret with some kind of machine learning algorithm what's actually being observed by the sensor, whether it's a pedestrian or other traffic, or what's being observed inside the vehicle. Similarly, healthcare sensors now have become even more critical as the kinds of devices, as we'll talk about this a little bit later on, moving more towards bio-based devices that are more embedded inside medical diagnostic processes or treatment processes. And so clearly the criticality of the accuracy of that event is pretty clear. I mentioned automated processes in the industrial marketplace. Remote sensing, the ability to really understand what's happening in our climate or our weather patterns have become increasingly more critical. So the remote sensing environment is also observed to be a place where sensor fusion and that diffusion is becoming more prominent. Surveillance applications, particularly in smart city environments, where we're taking a number of different kinds of measurements, perhaps a lighting, something that will help with the facial recognition or with movement. All of these things go into a database to determine what's actually happening in a given view from the sensor fusion that's taking place there. And sensor fusion in the sense of improved security through better threat detection or intrusion detection is another critical area. So there's at least these 7 different categories to think about for a drill down on device types and on applications where, because of the criticality, the investment is strong in new kinds of sensor technology, in sensor fusion, in data fusion, in connectivity. And a lot of that was evident at the show in many different examples, many of the presentations. Many of the speakers addressed these as subcategories, or in the booths themselves, many of the demonstrations touched on many of these subsegments. So the other aspect that I wanted to just highlight is the market opportunity. So that is a core area of market growth. And even though here we show sensor growth by individual functionality, individual event measurement, we actually would also suggest that these segments are growing because of that fusion, because of that multi-access across function capability. And as mentioned, biosensors, image sensors are receiving some of the highest level of investment and are expected to be strong in the next 5 years. As we understand, there are good applications for greater biomaterial usage for the sensors in medical devices. And image sensors are showing up nearly everywhere. You need image sensors for facial recognition, for biometrics, you need for measuring a lot of the types of phenomena to really interpret a visual, if you will, or image-based version of the data, and increased capability for sophisticated image processing is driving the value of image sensors as well. IoT sensors, so these are IoT modules that are part of most of the sensor delivery these days, is also seeing high growth. So there's a lot to be understood about where the growth is coming from, and it is a fast developing market, very strong to play in based on some of the trends we've already stated. And we weren't surprised then to see that the Sensors Expo actually showed expansion and increased activity. So at one point you might have thought it was about just sensors. Now it's about sensors connected to each other through IoT, used as an endpoint for building a artificial intelligence or machine learning system. And then by extension, what are the devices and industry applications? So the Expo really has a broad variety of activities being addressed beyond the sensor technology themselves, although there were quite a number of technical sessions that did just that as well. What we saw was 5,000 engineers and marketers and 250 suppliers attend the conference or make presentations at the conference. And it reflected the nature of the market. It's a good sampling of what's in the marketplace today. And that is to say, a highly fragmented market. I would say most of those 250 suppliers were small to medium companies, many of them of the startup variety, where there were only a handful of the large companies that are in fact one-stop shops with sensor types across many functionalities, most functionalities, addressing most of those applications I highlighted. So there's ample room for the medium and small companies and the startups to get into markets from a niche perspective as we see the trends of connectivity, fusion, or AI inside of a given industry, creating a new opportunity with a lot of the advanced chipsets that are available today, a lot of the new materials that are available today. Speaking of the chipsets and the IT players, they certainly were present as well. But their role, as we know, as we can observe, is to be market makers. They're not interested in actually making the chips themselves. They're going to source the sensors. They're going to source the sensors to push their technology, generally ARM, Qualcomm, Intel pushing their chip arrays and their control modules, where Microsoft is looking to promote its entire portfolio of devices and cloud, as well as some of the modules it's creating. So that market maker impact is really valuable on an industry that is expanding, exploding the way it is. It suggests that the one-stop shops are going to have more than enough new opportunity on their hands to expand, as well as create lots of opportunity for the medium and small companies, sponsored or at least market-made by some of these big IT players. Interesting cross-function technology that we saw was an emphasis on wearables, not just wearables for consumers. In fact, many speaker or exhibitor was clear to point out we're doing more than Fitbits. We're even doing more than Apple Watches with the sensor arrays that are required there. We're looking for wearables for critical uses, so clinical implementations and medical devices for real diagnostic purposes that the medical community will recognize as valuable data that they can act on. Similarly, wearables on the shop floor or in work environments where that data is critical to determine the productivity of the process or the productivity of a employee. So the use of wearable now sort of a cross-consumer trend coming into the market for critical use devices. And then the traditional issues that have faced the sensor marketplace were very much in evidence. The sensor technology as we move to different form factors of devices, particularly in wearables, we moved to different device types and looking for different kinds of measurement technologies, not the least of which is the biosensor market. We face power constraints. How do we ensure there can be enough onboard power and power management? How can we make sure the form factor is suitable to the device with an amount of power and sensing arrays and multi-sensor and sensor fusion even that's required? How do you get that into a form factor that's going to be suitable for the application? And then cost effectiveness. We've seen the price of sensors and the price of chips come down, but as they've come down, the uses tend to become a little bit more complex. And so the number of elements that are needed to be deployed tend to raise the price. So solving there were battery and power management companies present. Many of the startups were innovating on size, and they were all trying to find a better formula for cost. Last point, but not certainly the least, was IoT everywhere. Connectivity was clearly one of the key values driving the sensor market right now. Issue being the standardization of IoT is still in flux. Everything from the cellular networks, the Wi-Fi, to LoRa, to Cat-M. Which technology for connectivity will be appropriate? There isn't one that suits all cases, whether it be a Bluetooth device for short range or whether it be an LTE derivative or a Zigbee derivative for industrial or building environments. It's very important to understand just for courses there rather than expect there to be standardization. And so that's another cost concern for sensor developers. If they create a module with RF connectivity, what should it be? And that's going to have to be very purpose-built at this stage, because we did not see, to a certain extent, the sensor community is dependent on the larger IoT community coming together on standardization, and it hasn't happened yet. So moving on, there were a number of interesting types of devices and sensors on display that kind of pushed the envelope in various ways. One of the key themes was biocompatible devices, as I mentioned, that drives at a diagnostic solution or is being used in clinical trials or assessing, monitoring the behavior of an aging member of society to determine what their behaviors are, to see whether they need help or what can be done for them, or even for insurance purposes. So biocompatible devices that can basically be worn or embedded or somehow surround the patient or the person being measured to get at a health system issue is clearly a strong trend that's helping drive medical device industry and was strong at the conference. The combination of sensors and tuning of sensors to become more accurate was a major theme. We had collaborative radar sensors, for instance, which were able to drive location accuracy to 5 millimeters, really trying to strengthen that, not necessarily yet understanding what the full application is going to be of that. So a flavor of this conference, of course, like any others, is a little bit of the R&D side. So let's invent a product and see what it can do, and then we'll see who comes by and says, yeah, I really need that application. So there's a little bit of that going on. Similarly with the low-cost MEMS microphone, which can be now detected ultrasound frequencies for $1. I mean, the price point for that and the sensitivity of that is really quite amazing considering the past. There was also artificial sensing on display for detecting gas. Another nuance on that was the program detecting the difference between Coke and Pepsi. What really that involved was creating a digital signature that represented the smell, quote unquote, of Coke versus the smell of Pepsi, and being able to have a distinguishing capability there. We saw machine learning in an onboard in-car sensor array that can be used to understand how to work with the behavior of passengers in a car, both for the driver safety application, but also maybe eventually for consumer marketing purposes. Are the people in the car looking like they're hungry or looking like they're tired, and what kind of advertising is that? So it's really taking the sensor technology to a level to provide an environmental feedback. And several of the major car companies are very serious about that in addition to the self-driving sensor arrays required for the car itself. And then the subject of cloud and IoT. So you don't need to necessarily have a sensor to be in the sensor business. You can be in the cloud business and use third-party sensors or third-party devices or install devices that have sensors embedded in them to create a fusion to offer an application that can measure many things: temperature, humidity, position, acceleration, lighting, electricity, magnetism. We saw some companies coming at it from that direction. So they're not necessarily sensor engineers. They're more software or data companies saying, how do we leverage the existing sensor platforms or partner with sensor third parties to create an application that can be accessed via the cloud. Think of that as a completely different kind of model that's out there that we saw emerging. And then last but not least, we can go for sub $1 printed circuits using contactless current sensors, new ways to try and push that cost and power management down to still allow the sensors to be effective to measure what's required. I'm going to pick up the pace here a little bit.
We have a couple of questions that came in on that slide, so I thought we might just touch on them if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Perfect. One of the questions is, what is your definition of biocompatible devices?
So a device that can be embedded in the person, the host, using a biomaterial, so a biosensor essentially, that will not be, it doesn't have to be definitely biomaterial, but it has to be packaged in such a way that it is not going to cause an infection or have an issue in the biological system. So it has to be from a safety, either through biomaterials themselves or through a packaging in appropriate materials to measure the activity in the person's body without causing an interference in the system or in the body itself.
Thank you. The next question says, hi, Michael. Thanks for the summary. You mentioned that sensor fusion is a trend where multiple sensors are combined. So what is the difference between sensor fusion and smart sensor hubs that people are talking about?
I will have to come back to you on that one. I actually didn't get that much about smart sensor hubs, so the off the top of the brain answer would be when I hear smart, I think there's going to be some kind of machine learning algorithm involved to try and make the data output, quote unquote, smarter, interpretable by the machine and then fed back. That's what smart means to me. Sensor fusion doesn't require that. Sensor fusion can be measuring something to a higher degree of accuracy, but there doesn't have to be any machine learning involved. And it doesn't necessarily even have to be in a connected network. It can be a single device that's just improved accuracy through a multiplicity of sensor functions, which is a traditional sensor fusion definition that's been around for quite a while. So, but I will take a quick stab at maybe refining that distinction a little bit on the feedback.
Thank you.
Okay, running through this. On the keynotes, there were three that we're highlighting here, which it was interesting that not one of these keynotes is actually from a sensor provider, which was striking at this conference. Why did the conference decide to do that? Because I think, to the point, applications of sensors are really diversifying. So what about that is interesting to the sensor community? The HoloLens was deconstructed for us by the Microsoft engineer, was very interesting. So what are where and how are the 3D vision sensors placed, and how are they combined with the 3D modeling to create a 3D model in physical space? So the demonstration of the HoloLens was quite cool, and amazing that the near 0 millisecond rendering of a augmented reality image in various applications was very impressive, considering we're dealing with basically a large headset. So that was the HoloLens, and does signify the drive there. We also got a data point that being very sensitive to heat in the processing environment for that HoloLens caused Microsoft to create its own specialized processor in order to make sure the heat dissipation was there for someone wearing one of these devices. You can imagine all that processing gives off a lot of heat. So we're going to see OEMs or device providers do what they have to get to that next step in the market, whether it's AR or another application. They're going to look to the general chip community. They're going to look to the general sensor community, but they'll be looking to invest in specialization that meets the device need. Important point, think about as you're developing for some of these larger players. Another large player, Dell, was present, whose investment is more in obviously the computer networks and computer servers and storage than it is in sensors itself. But we had a good presentation on the future of IoT and a focus on edge. So the sensor scalability that's going on at the endpoint is certainly requiring closer to the endpoint processing, and that will be at the edge. And the edge can be defined in many different ways. And it will also be a cost reduction processing for IoT. That was a very interesting point as well. And then there was an interesting presentation from a scientist at NASA about the use of sensors to essentially help feed measurements that are ruling out whether there is life in space or not. Essentially, Mars is not seen as being a place where life has existed or will exist. And there's new missions to Mars, and NASA made a call, and I'd make the same call to anyone on the phone that's interested in developing new and innovative sensor technology is needed to improve the accuracy of space missions by NASA. NASA actually had a booth because they do a lot of repurposing of their intellectual property in the marketplace for sensor providers as well. So I want to wrap up with a few comments about the Medical Sensor Design Conference. One of the highlights is to think about talk about expansive just in this one marketplace of medical. There are 100 trillion cells in the body, each producing about 20 gigabits of data. And so the amount of data to be mined, back to that biocompatible viewpoint, but not just biocompatible, the externalized sensor arrays as well, is rather powerful. And then we have the ability to understand that the devices are being improved by miniaturization, by that usage of biomaterials, and certainly by the connectivity and IoT trends we've already discussed. We do have measurements here just showing that there are actually two ways to think about sensors in the medical devices market. One is to attack the traditional market, which is shown on the left, where the main application is about drug delivery. But if you look at the market from a connectivity standpoint, it's really about monitoring. So those are two thoughts that were important to understand. There is a traditional market, but there's a movement, much smaller scale, but growing connectivity market, where monitoring is more the focus than drug dispensing or some of the more traditional medical device applications. Then we had the discussion about security. Security, of course, was a major theme at the conference overall. In the medical device space, the argument that you need to have two kinds of viewpoints on security, a security that addresses what's going on inside the database, the IoT system, and the servers, and security that's device specific. To solve those threats, we are talking about developing a security envelope where we have to have an array of not just sensors and programs, but user behavior as well, where we're driving at embedded alongside any sensor module should be a security protocol, either a hardware or software instance that's going to support device identification, going to support authentication, allow for stronger authorization of the correct usage of the device, and similarly is compatible then with network authorization methods, including encryption and authentication using public key infrastructure or other forms of digital certificates. So that was the major finding from this visit to the Sensors Expo. Just want to summarize, since we're at the bottom of our time, that we highlighted the sensor fusion and diffusion, so lots of new sensors and applications and lots of modules At the same time, think about purpose-built sensor fusion modules for critical applications. We observe that there's lots of room in the market for mid-size and startup companies, particularly with all these new kinds of applications and technical innovation, as well as room for the large one-stop shops to grow. Think about the partnerships or at least the attachments of ecosystems that the IT firms and chip makers are bringing to the marketplace, from that HoloLens example to many, many others. Again, wearables being a very important marketplace that expands actually the utilization of the sensor modules in a way that hasn't been seen before, and the consumer wearables marketplace extending itself into the critical application marketplace. Always trying to solve power constraints, miniaturization, and cost reduction are key themes for any sensor deployment going on in the market. IoT cannot be a one-size-fits-all. Overall, then, my summary statement is we're seeing a sensor innovation that's leading to increased sensitivity or accuracy, combined with the ability to be more connected across multiple kinds of applications using IoT. And then that smart comment that was into the question, all of this is allowing for a platform of intelligence, machine learning platform, cognitive computing platform, if you want to use IBM's term, to be deployed to improve the value of the sensors as well. All of that delivered in as small and as least cost form factor as you can, and we believe the envelope on those things will be continued to be advanced as we go deeper into the future. So that concludes my presentation, and I have time, I think, for a couple more questions.
Thank you, Michael, for all of those great insights and takeaways and things that you learned at the Expo, and for sharing all of those with us today. We do have a few questions that have come in, so if any of our participants have additional questions, please be sure to send them in, and we'll try to fit as many into this short amount of time as we can. To start, Michael, what was one of the most surprising discoveries for you at the Sensors Expo?
I think, as I listed it out here, the idea that sensor fusion becomes a bit of a ubiquitous concept, if that's the way I could put it. Understood beforehand that it is a technique required for certain critical applications. But as we understand the ability to increase connectivity, the ability to combine different sensor functions at a more reasonable price point, we're seeing a display of fusion in a lot more cases. And so to me, that was a theme that wasn't necessarily obvious once we going to the show. As a takeaway, it certainly became a surprise.
Great. I'm going to keep moving on. Any novel materials needed or seen at the show specifically for new sensors?
The only one I would point to biomaterial usage was interesting. The more you can embed the sensor itself within the ecosystem of the host. I would say biosensors still tends to be. There was some coverage of nanosensors as well for different applications, but I think the markets are still pretty nascent for nanosensors. So those were the two that kind of stood out as pushing the materials envelope.
Great. What will the most important place to invest in sensor technology be in the future?
I think it's about picking a industry. So the top three right now that are driving that future perspective would be automotive, healthcare, and industrial. Maybe with a smart city or surveillance one being fourth. So by industry, it would be in that case. And then it's really taking the topic of all of the things, trying to make it as sensitive, connected, connection-friendly, and, of course, size appropriate. So take that as sort of some leading industry places. We're seeing companies begin to gain traction with those 2 or 3 leading industries.
Great. Thank you. This will be the last question that we covered today, so if you send in additional questions, participants, we will get them answered for you. Do you believe that this market is at or near the inflection point? And if so, why now?
It depends on how you define the inflection point, of course, but at a inflection point, I would say it is near it. We're still got a lot of pieces that are still being come together. I'd say certainly within the frame of the forecast. As you can see, our growth expectations are fairly ambitious within the next few years. The why now is what we're just talking about. There's a combination of, it was strange. Coming to the show in the past, you could say sensors were not all that interesting from a non-industry viewpoint. That is, they were interesting in themselves to push the envelope towards increased accuracy, fusion, and so on. But once they become part of this connectivity ecosystem, once they become part of this AI ecosystem, you get things like the HoloLens. You get really interesting new applications that would not exist without the sensor innovation. So we think a very close, I guess my summary would be, to an inflection point. And connectivity, lower cost processing, and the advent of more sophisticated algorithms are some of the key reasons for that. Much more use can be made of the sensors, and the sensors themselves can be deployed much more flexibly than ever before.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Michael, for your time, and thank you to all of our participants. That wraps up our State of the Union on Sensors Technology and Michael's time at the Expo itself. So thank you all, and we hope to see you again at future BCC Research events. Thank you.